All right, so now we're getting to the Hammer Frankenstein movie with the most metal title in the series, but also the most accurate, because when you watch Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, you don't think, you know what, maybe this Frankenstein guy should get destroyed when we get around to it. You don't think, maybe the world will be better off without this guy. No, you watch this and you think, okay, Frankenstein must die as soon as possible because this guy is the worst.
Must.
Hey, what's going on, my friends? Welcome again to the Cobwebs channel. My name is Daniel, and today we're continuing the Hammer Frankenstein review series that we've been doing. Now we're on to the fifth movie, Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed from 1969. And we got a movie that's a pretty big departure. You see, the movie kicks off Friday the 13th style with a masked guy going around and slicing another dude's head off, putting the head in a bag, carrying it off. And when we eventually see that guy rip his mask off, we see it's Baron Victor Frankenstein. And I love this moment when the mask comes off, when it's Peter Cushing. It's the most memorable moment of the movie for me. But this tells us we're in for something different. We're in for a different Frankenstein. We're probably in for somewhat of a different movie. So let's talk about what I really like about this movie. Now, I have always had some mixed feelings about it. I'm going to unpack them with you today. But the movie is undoubtedly well made. This is not an Evil of Frankenstein situation where we suddenly crash down in quality and get something way more schlocky and just sloppily written. Definitely not the case here. This is a well-made film. Looks beautiful. It's got some really good atmosphere to it, some really spooky streets, and some pretty great dialogue. Now, I said about Frankenstein Created Woman in the last review that movie's got probably my favorite line of dialogue in all of Hammer films. This one might have my second favorite.
Excuse me, I didn't know that you were doctors.
Doctors? We're not doctors.
I beg your pardon, I thought you knew what you were talking about.
Gosh, I just love that. I love those Frankenstein comebacks when he's the wittiest guy in the room and could just tear anyone down. The sick burns are so good. And if you're someone that really wants to watch an evil mad scientist, a Victor Frankenstein who's completely immoral and will do anything to further his experiments, then this is the movie for you. Because this is the movie that's going to give you that more than any others. Because in this movie, we have got an absolute bastard for Victor Frankenstein. And it's jarring. It feels like a huge departure because yes, he's a bad guy in Curse of Frankenstein, but he's also charming, charismatic, has some interesting relationships with people. Even that's gone by this movie. He is cold. He treats everyone around him horribly.
I'm afraid that stupidity always brings out the worst in me.
And this pretty well leads me into the parts of this movie that I just have mixed feelings about, as I said. Because on one hand, I do like an evil mad scientist, Victor Frankenstein. I love it in Curse of Frankenstein. But on the other hand, I did like how this series was growing him as a character. I liked how he was getting softened. I liked how by Frankenstein Created Woman, he felt like he had become fully formed as our anti-hero of this series. I was enjoying that, and I was just starting to love him, and this movie rips all that away, and it doesn't even feel like the same guy anymore.
He stinks, and I don't like him.
This leads me into talking about the continuity of this series. Now, we've been talking a lot about continuity, and it's an interesting conversation to have about a series that's this old, because when you binge through a series now, a movie franchise, you expect continuity. You want to see things continue and develop and grow because you're watching them all in close succession. And these movies are not designed for that. Back in the 1960s, you didn't really rewatch movies. Like, you were lucky if it came on TV, if maybe it had a re-release at your local theater, you know, that's cool. But for the most part, you don't get to rewatch movies very much. You go see it in the theater and then that's it. And that's kind of how they design these movies. So they're not as concerned with continuity. And here's my theory about this movie. I think this movie is a new Part 2, a replacement to The Revenge of Frankenstein. Now, this is not a novel thing for horror fans to see. I mean, the Halloween franchise has got like 3 different Part 2s. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, like every sequel is actually a Part 2. Like none of them have anything to do with each other. They're all just bouncing off the first movie. And I think that's what we get here, because this feels like a continuation of that Curse of Frankenstein character, in that he hadn't had 3 movies to soften over time. Instead, he had only hardened and just become a worse person than he even was in that movie. And I feel like this point is only strengthened when you look at what the experiment of the movie is. Okay, let me try to explain the experiment of this movie for you, because this movie actually doesn't do a great job doing it. It's really just through exposition. The movie doesn't really do anything to reinforce the story, just has people kind of sit and explain things to you. Sometimes those characters explaining important parts of the backstory aren't even on screen when they're talking.
And he claimed that anyone undergoing such surgery family could survive.
Which makes it even more difficult to really follow, okay, what's going on here? But essentially, Frankenstein had an assistant named Dr. Brandt, an assistant he never actually met in real life. They just corresponded with. They were like internet friends, basically, pen pals, and they shared secrets together. And this guy went insane. Too bad, so sad. And now Frankenstein can't get the knowledge out of Dr. Brandt. And this knowledge is how to freeze a brain so that you can preserve it and then use it later to extract knowledge from it. This movie makes a big deal out of the fact that Frankenstein and Brandt figured out how to transplant brains, but now they want that next step. They want to freeze the brain for further use. And this feels like it's negating the other sequels because we've just moved on from that. Like, Frankenstein has just done better by this point. We did a brain transplant in The Revenge of Frankenstein. In fact, it was cooler then because Frankenstein built the body that he put the brain into. Then we went on to Evil Frankenstein. You know, that's a little bit of a wash because that's kind of a reboot too. But then Frankenstein created a woman. He's transferring souls. His experiments are getting bigger, better, more exciting, more interesting. And this movie's just a brain transplant. And I'm sorry, but it's just not enough. And now we're kind of getting into the parts of this movie that I don't really care for because I just don't think this is exciting enough. He's not even building any bodies. He's not taking body parts, stitching them together. This is a brain transplant. That is it. That's all you're going to get. And like, not good enough. You see, Frankenstein just intended to cure Brandt's insanity so he can get the secret, but then he realizes that Brandt is about to die, so he needs a healthy body, so he has his assistant Karl go out and kill some guy so that they can put Brandt's brain into him. By the way, who is Karl? Okay, so there's a couple other characters in this movie I haven't mentioned. Frankenstein comes into a town at the beginning of this movie, realizes he needs a place to live. He goes and rents a room at a boarding house run by Anna. And there he discovers that Anna's mom is in the hospital. Karl is a doctor at that hospital. And Karl is stealing drugs, selling them on the black market to earn the money to keep her getting the care she needs. Frankenstein blackmails them. Now, throughout this series, we've got these movies where Frankenstein has these assistants, these really great characters, and he's got these great relationships with these guys. And for his assistants in this movie, he has very unwilling assistants, people who hate him, people who he hates back, and he's just blackmailing them to use the space for his experiments and to get them to do anything he wants. And he treats them like garbage. So the relationships in this movie are just bleak and horrible. He basically turns Karl into a murderer, uses Karl to just go out and do his killing for him at that point. And he treats Anna, played by Veronica Carlson, so horribly. I almost don't want to talk about it, but we have to talk about it. Now, I love Veronica Carlson. She's kind of a Hammer legend. She's in a lot of other Hammer films, but I feel like I love her like a little sister. Like, I want her to be happy. I want her to be safe. And I want her to be with a good guy, particularly Barry Andrews from Dracula's Risen from the Grave, because I love her in Dracula's Risen from the Grave, and her relationship with Paul, played by Barry Andrews. They're one of my favorite couples in like all of horror movies. But here, like throughout the movie, she's treated like garbage by Frankenstein. But then also there's an assault scene where Frankenstein assaults Anna. And it was a late addition to this movie that director Terrence Fisher did not want to do. Actors Peter Cushing and Veronica Carlson did not want to do this. It was not in the script, not something they agreed to. And the producer, there's been a lot of talk in the internet, by the way, about studio interference, and this is an interesting case of it in 1969. The producer insisted on it to please American distributors, to have more lewd content, more exploitation-like content. So they throw in an assault scene, and it feels so wrong. It also kind of reinforces that this is a new part two, because Curse of Frankenstein is the only other movie where Frankenstein shows any sexual interest. In the rest of the movies, he's like an asexual character who only cares about science. But even in Curse of Frankenstein, like, he's just having an affair. It's consensual. He treats her terribly by the end, but it's a consensual affair. And in this movie, it's so out of character. Like, not in a million years do I believe that Frankenstein would do this, not based on the past movies. And I hate this scene so much. I think it's such a blight on this. And it does ruin the movie for me. Like, I'm sorry, but it does. This movie is such a bleak, hopeless, miserable experience. And look, I want to be clear here. I know this is a horror movie. I know horror movies are supposed to horrify you. I get it. So you could say this is the most horrifying of the Frankenstein movies, so it's the best. Well, I think we do come to horror movies for different reasons, and I love Hammer films. I admit it, for how cozy they are. I think they're just really cozy, comfortable movies that I love. They're such warm blankets for me, like pretty much all of them are. And this movie is miserable. This movie makes me feel horrible. But okay, let's talk about the monster in this movie, because this is a Frankenstein movie, right? We're gonna get a monster. Well, like I said, all we get is a brain transplant. So when Brandt awakens in a new body, he's just a guy, and he's like really calm and chill, and he says he wants revenge, and he does go after revenge in the end, but he's just so calm and chill about it the whole time. There is a scene where he reunites with his wife. He goes to see her, and there is just a tinge of sadness in there that I wouldn't say is profound or heartbreaking or anything like that, but you can just feel the sadness of it. And I was just like, okay, that's kind of effective. We're getting into some real faint praise here. But he is just a guy, and he doesn't have much screen time. So in the department of wanting a Frankenstein movie to satisfy you with a Frankenstein monster, this movie definitely doesn't deliver. Also, other thing I don't like about this movie, Thorley Walters is back. He was the assistant Frankenstein created woman. This time he's a totally different character, which is confusing enough already. He's an inspector, and all of his scenes feel very tacked on. And when I looked into this movie, it seems they were just trying to add some comedy to this movie, which is so weird because, like I said, it's a bleak, miserable movie. And if you're going to make that, then make it, stick with it. But instead we got these random scenes of very unfunny comedy with Thorley Walters as the inspector investigating things that we already know the answers to. So the investigation's pretty boring, and that stuff stinks, and it makes the movie longer. This movie is actually an hour 40 minutes, which is longer than I think any other classic Hammer film. I don't think any of them reach an hour and 40 minutes. The movie does feel slower than a lot of them, but at the same time, the ending is so rushed. Like, I kind of feel like, okay, we're getting into the climax. We're getting into Brandt's revenge. Oh, the movie's over. Okay, that's it. All right, so let's rate Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed. So for atmosphere, I'm actually going to go with an 8. I think the atmosphere is really good in this movie. Like I said, you got some really dark, foggy street scenes that have such a great gothic atmosphere. I like the look of his laboratory. It's in the basement. It's not amazing, but it does look spooky. Overall, this is just solid Hammer atmosphere. Now for characters, I'm going to go with a 4. I don't like Frankenstein in this movie. I don't like how drastically they change his character.
You're damn rude, huh?
I understand if you do. If you just want to see the worst mad scientist you can watch, then have at it. I like Anna, but Karl's pretty boring and definitely unlikable, and the monster just doesn't do it for me here. For story, I'm gonna go with a 5. Like I said, this experiment that he's doing is just not good enough. The series has gone so much bigger and better, and to just take us way down to basics to something that we've already seen so much and better was just not enough. Otherwise, the movie is just an exercise in nihilism and brutality, watching Frankenstein treat people like garbage, and I don't enjoy it that much. For scares, I'm gonna go with a 4. Now, Frankenstein does disturbing things, but they feel just out of place, out of character, so they just don't work for me as scares, certainly. The monster doesn't really bring anything to that department, but I think one of my favorite scenes in this movie is they actually bury Brandt's body after the operation. They took his brain out of his head, and randomly a water main bursts right where they buried him, so water is shooting up, and it's like shooting his hand up out of the ground, and it's just so insane. I don't know if we can call that a scare sequence, but it does involve a dead body, so I do love that scene, I gotta admit. All in all, I think the atmosphere of this movie, technically how it looks, drags it on up to a 6, which is exactly what I gave it on Letterboxd at 3 out of 5. That's a wrap for this one, folks, but if you missed the other videos of my Hammer Frankenstein series, definitely click this playlist right over here. You can check them all out, and hit the subscribe if you don't want to miss the next Hammer Frankenstein review, because that will be coming very soon. I'll also link right here my top 15 Frankenstein movies of all time. I did have a lot of fun making that list video, so you can check that out. With all that said, don't forget to enjoy yourself today, have some fun, and I'll see you next time.